Good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining, and welcome to this Inside Hub session on why human rights risk analyses still matter. My name is Sofía Vélez Klumpp, and I'm a consultant and impact measurement expert at Löning. As part of my role here, I have specialized in human rights and environmental due diligence in the textile and agricultural sectors. I have also worked extensively on human rights risk analyses, both for companies' own operations as well as supply chains. I have the pleasure of moderating today's webinar, and along with me, I have my two wonderful colleagues, Nika Urbach and Maxine Bichler. A quick intro to those who don't know us yet. Löning is an international management consultancy specialized in business and human rights and based in Berlin. We advise companies on all aspects and elements of human rights and environmental due diligence, including risk analyses, strategy alignment, and measures. During today's session, we will look specifically at the topic of risk assessments. We will focus on their ongoing relevance for both companies' due diligence efforts and the streamlining of internal processes. But before we dive into the topic, let me briefly present the two speakers I have with me today. Maxine is a consultant and lead of the strategic alignment workstream at Löning. She leads our company's work on CSRD and supports businesses in developing and implementing human rights due diligence. With expertise in qualitative analysis and risk assessments, Maxine helps businesses identify and address human rights risks across their value chains in line with international standards and regulatory requirements. Nika is an associate consultant and head of environmental workstream at Löning, and she specializes in the environmental dimensions of corporate sustainability, advising companies on regulatory frameworks such as the CSRD and EKSG, but also the EUDR and the EU taxonomy. Nika has conducted multiple human rights risk analyses for multinational corporations in the manufacturing, textile, chemical, and pharmaceutical sector. Thank you both for joining as our web experts in this webinar today. Now I would like to briefly mention a few housekeeping rules. So our Inside Hub sessions are structured as 45-minute webinars featuring expert insights and interactive discussions with our audience. We will begin with a 30-minute conversation on the topic, and then the last 15 minutes will be dedicated entirely to Q&A. Please use the Q&A function for your questions instead of the chat function. If we run out of time and any questions remain unanswered, we will follow up with answers after the session. And there will also be a recording of the webinar available for you to share afterwards. That being said, let's dive into the topic of today's session. So discussions around supply chain due diligence legislations have been growing in the past years. And on an EU level, we have the ongoing omnibus reform proposals taking place, but other regions are moving ahead, with countries such as Canada, South Korea, and Japan advancing their own due diligence initiatives. With this dynamic development of regulations, we have seen clients become increasingly unsure about how to address the various legal requirements. Added to this, today's economic instability, driven by supply chain disruptions and trade frictions, is amplifying hesitation and complexity for businesses. In such context of uncertainty, human rights risk analyses play a crucial role in guiding companies' efforts. They lay the foundation for the next steps of human rights and environmental due diligence, but they also allow companies to prioritize specific risks and therefore allocate resources efficiently. Beyond compliance, it can also deliver tangible economic benefits by creating more resilient and reliable business operations and supply chains. But let's start by going back to the basics. Nika, could you explain what exactly it is we mean when we talk about human rights risk analyses?
Yeah, of course. Thank you, Sofía. I hope everyone can hear me. So yeah, let's first dive into the definition of what actually a human rights risk analysis is. And that means going back to some of the foundational documents of business and human rights, namely the UN Guiding Principles and the OECD Guidelines on Responsible Business Conduct. Both documents state that companies shall establish appropriate and effective risk management systems in order to identify, assess, prevent, and mitigate human rights risks in their supply chains. And as you can directly hear from this definition, the essential first step for your effective due diligence is always to find out which risks you actually have or could have. Because without looking for and identifying your risks, you simply have no idea where to start. The findings does help you to gain an understanding of your company's risk exposure and whether and to what degree there is actually a high risk of violations taking place. And if yes, where and how these are taking place. The second part then is assessing these risks, meaning to give them value of some sort, to establish a hierarchy of action. Because you can never eliminate all risks you might have in your supply chains at once. So you need to prioritize and start somewhere. And you usually start with the most salient risks. Salient in the sense of the UNGPs means those risks that are most severe and most likely to occur. What does that exactly mean? According to the UNGPs, the severity of an impact is determined by 3 factors: scale, scope, and irremediability. Scale assesses the gravity of the impact, so how harmful or hurtful the impact is to the individual or community. Scope, on the other hand, describes the extent of the harm, so how many people are affected or could be affected by it. Irremediability, lastly, describes the possibility of the harm to be undone and to reinstate a state prior to the harm. So, for instance, if we look at occupational health and safety, a non-curable disease like cancer is non-remediable, while, for instance, a broken arm is remediable. Likelihood, on the other hand, refers to the probability of the harm occurring and can be assessed based on sector and country data in an abstract risk assessment first. In a more specific and concrete assessment following that, likelihood can also be based on previous instances of the violation happening or on insights from company audits or other specific information you might have about a specific site or supplier. And yeah, these are already the 2 main functions of human rights risk analysis: identifying and assessing or prioritizing risk, which then forms the basis for your risk management related decisions, so that you can make informed choices on the resources and expertise you need to mitigate the most harmful and the most critical risk first.
Thank you so much, Nika. Now that we looked at the relevance of human rights risk analysis in the due diligence cycle and also how risks are to be assessed, could you explain perhaps whether and how human rights risks are actually linked to business risks? I think this is a very important point that we see in recurring discussions, so maybe you could also share some insights on that.
Yeah, of course. Oftentimes, the term human rights risk is not completely understood or is mixed with business risks. So it is first important to mention that when we talk about human rights risk, we always specifically refer to risks to people. In a business context, however, it is often the concept of risk is often used for a risk to the business, so to the company itself, such as compliance issues, litigation, or also reputational damage. But are these risks to the business always separate from human rights risks? At first glance, they may seem separate. However, as illustrated in this visual, we can see the connection. Human rights impacts, represented here within the triangle, highlight the most acute social and environmental impacts a company can have on people or the environment. So grave impacts on people labor rights or children's rights or also community rights. And interestingly, as this visual also shows, especially the most severe human rights impacts often strongly align with risks to the business. Salient human rights risk could lead to litigation, reputational harm, operational disruptions, increased conflict management costs, or other business losses, especially in the medium to long term, which means that, yes, human rights risks are also business risks in the traditional sense, which also means that finding and assessing your human rights risk in the supply chains means also to find and assess potential financial and legal risk for the business in the long run. However, when addressing risk in a human rights risk assessment, what we're speaking about today, we are always talking about risks to rights holders. These could include your own employees, but also third-party employees working on your premises, like in logistics or facility management, or of course, workers within your supply chains and affected communities. When we usually do risk analysis for clients, we first identify the relevant stakeholders. then the potential risk topics typical for the sector or as required by the law, and then we assess the severity and likelihood for each topic and each rights holder group to enable a really rights holder centered analysis, and following that to enable rights holder centered decisions in the long run in line with the process of the UNGPs.
Thank you so much, Nika, also for providing us with this connection between human rights risks and business risks. I think this is something quite relevant for the actual and current debate. And in the webinar's introduction, I had also mentioned that one of the challenges that companies are facing is the evolving legal landscape. And tied to these dynamics is usually the question, what are the requirements for risk analysis under the different legislations? So could you give us some insights into that as well?
Yeah, of course. So as Sophia just pointed out, the legislative landscape surrounding due diligence obligations is complex and, as all of you know, currently undergoing constant adjustments. So as most of you know, reporting obligations under the LKSG have recently been halted, and the Commission has also initiated so-called omnibus proposals to reduce the scope and also change the content of many of these due diligence legislations. However, due diligence obligations are still omnipresent and remain in force under multiple legislations, such as the LKSG, but also the EUDR or the EU taxonomy as of right now. And since many of the changes of the Commission are not yet in force, we can still have a look at what the law, as it currently still applies, says about risk assessments. I think also the first and most important point here is that risk assessments are required by all due diligence legislations. As I said before, identifying and assessing risk is foundational and a central part to the due diligence process. And these assessments usually require both more abstract, general, country and sector level assessments, as well as more concrete, in-depth, or also specific assessments at a later stage. This is then usually following a risk-based approach, meaning to consider and filter those risks that are most severe and most likely to occur, as I explained previously. So if we look at the LKSG, for instance, the first law on the slide here, regular risk analyses should cover own operations and direct suppliers, while ad hoc analyses should be based on substantiated concerns or raised grievances, and they also apply to the deeper supply chain. A similar approach now with the differentiation of the substantiated concerns for the deeper supply chain was also now proposed for the CSDDD in Omnibus. This means that mapping the whole supply chain is still very useful if you have a high possibility of severe risk in the deeper supply chain. So if you know of any high risk topics that are very likely to occur in your deeper supply chain, you still need to assess these risks under the current regulatory framework. This mapping requirement then is even more substantial and specified in the EUDR and in the EU BR, so the EU deforestation regulation and the EU battery regulation, where you need to trace your product or commodity back to their origin. So for the EU BR, this is the mine of the mineral in question, or for the EUDR, this is the specific field of harvest for your product. And the CSRD even requires coverage of both upstream and downstream chain of activities. A second point I would like to make is about the differentiation between abstract and concrete assessments. So the LKSG guidance is quite specific about this approach, that you should start with an abstract country and sector level assessment first, to then move to a more concrete one focusing on specific sites. The CSDDD, on the other hand, doesn't call this abstract and concrete, but speaks about a general assessment first and then an in-depth assessment of those areas where risks were found to be most severe and most likely to occur. So it is comparable in a way to the concrete analysis under the LKSG. The EUDR, on the other hand, interestingly, moves back and forth away in between concrete supplier-specific risk assessment, which then, after you've conducted the specific part, need to be checked against abstract country and regional level data. So for instance, you have like your supplier concrete information at hand, all the document and geolocalization data, but then there's a high prevalence of corruption in a given country, or high chances of human rights violations in a certain Palma region, which then means you need to go back from this abstract data again to reassess your specific supplier's risk data again. So this is an interesting back and forth approach stipulated by the EUDR. And yeah, to conclude, I think we can see that these legislations differ in scope and content in many aspects, but certain approaches for risk assessments are beginning to be solidified and are here to stay. And yeah, including, and most importantly, I think this is the risk-based approach that I just explained.
Thank you so much, Nika. I think this is very insightful and interesting. And now that we looked at these varying legal requirements on an EU level, and also have seen how risk assessments play a fundamental part in all of them, I would like to turn to the expectations around risk analyses. So through our work with companies and also other actors, we have observed that these have been evolving. Maxine, could you provide us with an overview of what different stakeholders are expecting from risk analyses?
Of course, thank you, Sofía. And that's absolutely right. We're noticing that through the changing legal landscape, there have definitely been altered expectations around human rights risk analyses. While there are several, I would like to focus on three main developments today. But before jumping into those, I'd also just like to emphasize that the underlying idea of a risk analysis hasn't changed. So companies still need to identify, assess, and address potential and actual impacts on people. But what is changing is how detailed, how credible, and how actionable these analyses are expected to be. So with this being said, the first development I'd like to highlight is that we are noticing there is a broader stakeholder interest. By this, I mean that until recent, results of risk analyses have primarily, not only, but primarily been used for internal purposes, such as decision-making reasons. But today, we are noticing that the audience is much wider. For example, investors and banks are using the results to assess whether a company is a reliable partner. Regulators use them to check compliance. NGOs use them as a basis for dialogue, and rights holders use them to hold companies accountable. And this broader audience means risk analyses must be more credible, understandable, and also practical. So they're not just a technical exercise anymore, but they are becoming a shared reference point for a dialogue between business and its different stakeholders. The second shift that we are seeing is the change from abstract to concrete risk analyses. And Nika briefly touched upon this. So an abstract assessment is an essential starting point because it maps the sector risks linked to the company's activities, supply chains, and workforce. So it's useful as it highlights the structural and systemic issues that might otherwise actually remain hidden in individual audits, for example. So you could say through the assessment, you are able to identify that there is a high risk of children working from home to support family income, which might not necessarily show as a result of an audit or certification. But companies are now also expected to complement the abstract results with more concrete and company-specific data. So this can also already include country risks, grievances, audit results, stakeholder engagement, but also other types of evidence that makes prioritization more tailored and actionable. So the aim of a concrete risk analysis is really to know where the highest risks of violations are, both at the company and site level, and to identify high-risk sites for further engagement, and through that build tailored action plans. But we see this as definitely being driven through greater stakeholder interests. So referring back to the stakeholders mentioned earlier, regulators want more traceable methodologies. Rights holders expect their realities to be reflected beyond abstract categories, and NGOs are increasingly challenging companies that stop at the sector level. Regarding this point, I also just wanted to mention that we are seeing companies relying much more on digital tools as well to speed up the process of the abstract assessments and to more quickly map sector risks. And these can definitely be useful, but we also want to emphasize to not just stop there, because the real credibility comes from tailoring those insights into your company's specific context and engaging with experts who can also validate the methodology and results. And the final development I want to highlight today is greater accountability. So we are noticing that companies are asking us much more detail about how our methodology works. And in many cases, they also want to take ownership of parts of the process themselves. And we think this is partly because under the CSRD, auditors will review not only the results, but also the process. So transparency and documentation are more important than ever nowadays. But here again, it also reflects the pressure from other stakeholders. So investors and financial institutions are increasingly scrutinizing risk analyses outcomes to assess resilience. NGOs are also asking for disclosure on methods, and rights holders here too demand to see their voices to be taken into account during the assessment. So the expectations that we're seeing is not just to publish a list of risks and results, but also to show how those risks were identified, prioritized, and how they are being acted upon. As a final point here, I'd just like to mention that with these three developments, they really show why risk analyses remain the cornerstone of human rights due diligence and why they're also not going away. And our advice to companies is to also use the synergies across these regulations, invest in robust and transparent methodologies, and tailor sector insights to your company's realities. Those that do not so or simply do the exercise to comply, or we notice those that not only comply also strengthen the trust with the different stakeholders in question.
Thank you, Maxine, for pointing out these various expectations that different stakeholders have towards companies' risk analyses and also how these have changed over time. I think it's a very interesting insight, also given the current developments we see in terms of legal requirements. And we've already briefly touched upon the methodology of a human rights risk assessment, but could you give us some insights into how these evolving expectations have also influenced the changes in methodology? Maybe you can share a few insights on that too.
Yeah, happily. We have definitely seen that there has been a shift, as I've mentioned, but as a consequence, we've had to expand the methodology of our human rights risk analyses to also fit with the changing expectations. But as we've seen, the basis of a risk assessment always remains the same. So as it's primarily based on severity and likelihood of activities or within the sector as a first level of prioritization. And for this reason, I'd like to take us all back to the basis and explain first how we at Löning conduct an abstract risk analysis, as this is the most important starting point. So typically we start off by mapping the areas of a business. So this can include a company's own operations, its supply chains, and also where relevant downstream activities. Once these are mapped, we identify key stakeholder groups who could potentially be affected. So that can cover workers within their own operations, third-party workers. Nika briefly mentioned logistics workers earlier. Of course, workers in the wider supply chain, communities, and also end users. And depending on the context, we also look if there are more vulnerable groups involved, which could include children, women, or people with disabilities, just to name a few. After the business areas and the rights holders have been mapped, we determine key human rights topics that are most relevant for the rights holder groups in the specific business areas. Here we most commonly cover topics, the most important ones within the business context, those that are covered under the LKSG, but we also take into account different contexts, different legislations, but to name a few topics we cover is like child labor, forced labor, health and safety, discrimination and working hours. But we really take into account the context for the business and also which regulations they fall under to tailor the topics as much as possible. And by assessing severity and likelihood, we can determine the abstract risk scores for the sector. At this point, we also typically add a layer of prioritization on top, which really focuses on the country-related risks. And we do that through our Löning country risk register, which provides a detailed insight into the likelihood of human rights risks in the countries where operations and supply chains are located. So I just wanted to take a couple of minutes to go through this because we find that the basis of our risk assessment methodology has allowed us to easily adapt to the changing demands of the clients and the landscape. So one of the adjustments we've taken recently is to update our methodology to go beyond this abstract stage and to include elements of a concrete assessment. So within our framework, we have now included additional levels of prioritization. Like I've mentioned, we cover grievance data, results of audits or certification, but it can also include topics such as leverage and influence, buying or selling volume, or also the strategic importance of certain products. And importantly, we also encourage our clients to always engage with stakeholders as much as possible to ensure that their voices and realities are reflected in the concrete results. And this can help companies move from a generic sector risk profile to a tailored and actionable set of priorities. So while the concrete assessment is much more closely linked to our methodological framework, we have also been expanding in other ways to meet the demands of clients and other actors. So as I mentioned earlier, clients are expecting greater accountability and more ownership. This means that we've seen our role has, for some clients, slightly changed from conducting the assessments as a whole to supporting clients in carrying out the risk analyses themselves. So we're acting as sparring partners. For example, here I would just like to mention we have a client that works in the retail and food sector, and we have been working with them for various years to conduct risk assessments, but more recently they have taken the initiative on themselves. So we've prepared a handbook with them with an explanation of our methodology and how they could roll out the process internally. In line with this, we also provide our clients with regular guidance, training, and also updates from our sector and country risk registers so that they can scale the approach across organizations or different teams. And finally, in line with the growing stakeholder interest, we have also placed more emphasis on stakeholder engagement. So we integrate input from affected groups, civil society, or other experts more systematically into our analyses. And at the same time, we also work with clients to extract the right insights from the risk analyses for their different audiences. So to extract the most relevant information for regulators, investors, NGOs, or also rights holders themselves. And this allows the results of the assessment to be used as a form of dialogue as well. And just as a very quick final note, I'd like to say that our methodology, because our methodology also remains anchored in severity and likelihood, we have been able to develop a modular and flexible approach that really reflects the different requirements and questions that our clients have to guide them throughout the process of conducting a risk analysis tailored to their realities.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Maxine. I think these were very interesting insights. And before we turn to the Q&A, I would just really like to wrap up this discussion by turning to a bit of a more practical aspect of risk assessments. And I would like to pose the following question to both of you. If you had one practical recommendation for our audience on what to keep in mind when conducting risk analyses, what would it be? Maxine, maybe you want to start?
Sure. Yeah. So my tip would really be to become familiar with the requirements of the different legislations and to look for the synergies. So we've seen, the basis of a risk analysis remains the same. Sometimes there are different elements added on top of it. But even under the CSRD, the double materiality is based on severity and likelihood, additional factors as well. But you can use the basis to work more efficiently, also save resources. And just to go ahead with that. Nika, what would you say is your practical tip?
Yeah, I would, I think, add to that despite all the uncertainty going on, stay on track and enforce your due diligence systems and especially your risk assessments, because if your methodology is sound and based on a risk-based approach, no matter the regulatory requirement, you can prove that you're diligently working on finding these risks, and then you can also diligently decide what to do about these risks. So I think, continue working on it, because otherwise you will also be completely confused, as most of us are right now with the different changes going on. But this risk-based approach is there to stay. It's very central, and continue enforcing that. I think that would be my tip.
Thank you so much for your insights. And I think we've seen that risk analyses remain highly relevant, not only as a necessary step to comply with legal obligations, but also as a tool to reduce economic costs for companies and also streamline efforts. I think this is what you meant, Maxine, when you said we should look at the different legislations. And this is along the entire value chain, right? So expectations towards companies are increasing, not just from legal requirements, but also from other stakeholders. And risk analyses really provide a robust basis to account for these expectations and guide businesses' efforts. And maybe as a final note from my side, I would really like to encourage companies to not see risk assessments as yet another bureaucratic task. Instead, you can really leverage your insights from risk analyses to make your business operations more resilient by, for example, strengthening your relationship with suppliers or also deepening your understanding of your supply chains. And risk assessments really offer valuable information that you can use across your organization to really improve your business's performance. So that being said, we would now like to turn to the Q&A part of our session. I think we have quite a few interesting questions. So maybe we could start. I see a question here that says, from a regulatory perspective, is there any difference between human rights risk assessments and human rights impact assessments, or are they fundamentally addressing the same topic or requirement? So maybe, I don't know, one of the two of you can start, whoever feels like going first.
Yeah, I can start with that. Human rights impact assessments and human rights risk assessments are not the same thing, because human rights impact assessments, they usually go deeper into one specific case. So you would do an impact assessment usually on the ground with stakeholders, really deep dive into like what the issues in this specific area or sector or at the specific supplier are, and then assess these risks. Whereas the risk assessment is more a management tool for you to start off with, okay, where do I even get started on my human rights risks? Maxine, I'm not sure if you want to add anything to that.
I think you covered it quite well, and they also covered or use different methodologies, which I think is important to consider.
Great. Thank you so much, both. There is another quite interesting question that asks if a company mainly serves as a retailer and doesn't have own production sites, how they can effectively advocate for better environmental and human rights practices in the value chain. I think this also goes in line probably with the topic of leverage, how much leverage you actually have on your suppliers, because the person here is also stating that there might be resistance from essential or critical suppliers when it comes to providing data or implementing processes. And if they are pushed too hard, they might just go and find a different retailer with less thorough due diligence practices. So maybe you could also, give some insights on that. Maxine, maybe you want to go first this time?
Sure. Yeah, it's a really interesting question. And here I think it shows why the starting point of an abstract assessment is so important, so that you first have an overview of where you need to focus your efforts in the first prioritization, but then also the second level of priorities or priority criterion is very helpful, particularly, Sofía, as you said, leverage. But here we also then recommend looking, for example, at your buying or selling volume. You can consider also like the global market share to see how you might fall in relation to competitors for specific suppliers, which can be also done through like web crawling digital solutions. And then it's really worth seeing what actions need to be taken following this. So do you need to prepare SAQs? How can you best work with the suppliers to really have start a dialogue basis on tackling the risks together? Yeah. Nika, would you want to add anything on top of this?
Yeah, I would also add to the point that like if you have resistance from like one essential supplier and they're sort of I don't want to say threatening you, but like not cooperating, then try to work together with the other retailers, right? Like work together in multi-stakeholder initiatives, organize yourselves and work together on the issues because the other retailers have probably the same obligations and interests as you do. So I would say look out for these initiatives. There are a lot, and try to work together and then address the suppliers again.
Thank you so much. Yes, I think these are very interesting points. And maybe if I could just add very briefly, I think it is also quite helpful if you have a strong relationship with your suppliers, which is also what we try to kind of address through this webinar as well, that it can really help also to make them understand why this might also be important for them and quite relevant for them as well, and how maybe already processes that they have in place might help them to really comply with these expectations that you have. So it's not really starting from scratch. It's actually looking at the processes that they might already have in place and that can help them to fulfill your expectations towards them. So maybe this is also helpful. There is another question that we could maybe address briefly. So this person asks if they should have a human rights risk assessment for the businesses in an abstract or general point of view, and also one for each country or even site we operate. So I think this is also something that we try to address through the webinar. Maybe Nika, you can give some insights on this because I think you touched upon that mainly.
Yeah, exactly. So yeah, I think here the risk-based approach we spoke about is essential. So you do not need to carry out in-depth assessment of every single country operator, and if it's a lot of countries. Obviously, if it's 2 countries or like if you're just based in one country, that's a different case. But if you have suppliers in a lot of different countries, you need to follow a risk-based approach. And first of all, see on like abstract country level data, sector data, what could be the risk or what could be like the highest risk sides. And for your own operations, you usually have different requirements coming from different laws, right? So like if you have an operation based in Germany and one based in Switzerland, let's say, you would need to obviously still comply with the local laws there. And I think most of these laws, especially like in the European context, already allow you to fulfill a lot of the obligations as well. I would say not an assessment for every single country is necessary, but first follow the risk-based approach.
Perfect. Thank you. Maxine, do you have anything you want to add to that, or shall we jump to the next question?
I think just very briefly, like Nika said, the risk-based approach is interesting here, but also keeping in mind the link or the step from the abstract to the concrete or the in-depth assessment under the CSDDD. And we had a client where we did this exercise with actually starting from the LKSG abstract risk assessment, we were able to identify key high-risk areas within their supply chain. And then we selected I think 5 or so out of those to really do deep dive research and also stakeholder engagements to understand what really is the cross-section of risks between the country and the sector risks here, so that the client would have a very detailed understanding of what risks they need to address in specific countries, how they should do that with their suppliers, and consequently set up an action plan following this.
Yeah, thank you so much. I think this is a very relevant point, starting first on an abstract level, and then really, as Nika also said, using the risk-based approach to go into more deeper, in-depth analyses for specific sectors or supply chains or own operation sites. Maybe just a very brief question on the country risk register. Someone asked if it also combines country and sector human rights risks. So yeah, maybe Nika, you want to answer that first?
Yeah, sure. No, the country risk register itself is only about country risks, but we do have a sector risk register, which then we combine based on the individual case of the client. Because usually, as most of you know, risks differ from country to country and sector to sector, but also within the country and within the sector. By that I mean the mining sector in one country has different risks than in another country. For instance, one has like more land rights issues, another has more labor rights issues or occupational health and safety, or more forced labor cases or these kind of things. So you need to, in order to like really have a specific assessment of that sector in that country, you need to deep dive into the specific cases, which is why then we usually use the country lens and we combine it with a specific sector lens for the client that we're working with.
Great, thank you so much. Maybe I could just briefly ask another question that I think has also come up in discussions that we've had with clients, and also if we think a bit about the ongoing legal turmoil in that sense. What if EKSG and CSDDD actually don't come? So do we still need risk analyses? Would you say that that's still important, even if there is no compliance obligation in that sense? Yeah, maybe as a kind of outlook for the end of our session. I don't know who wants to go first.
Yeah, I can go. I think that risk assessments are also important in the business sense, first of all, so that, as I explained in the beginning of the webinar, human rights risk can also lead to financial and reputational and legal risks. So you should look out for these risks in your supply chain also from that point of view. And also the compliance side, there are still other ways to so there are still laws in place which say that you have to respect human rights, right? Like in the specific countries as well. So I think you always need to look out like where your risks are and what your connection to these risks could be. And to find that out, you need to do risk assessments. Otherwise, you don't know where these potential risks could lie. So I would say even if the CSDDD is not coming, there are many other laws still in place that oblige you to look out for your risks and your human rights risks.
Thank you. Maxine, do you want to add anything briefly?
Yes, very quickly. I mean, the whole topic of corporate sustainability is to integrate sustainability-related aspects into core business strategies. So I think it's crucial to start also considering human rights risk assessments at the same level of financial risk assessments as companies do regularly. And otherwise, I think what Nika covered is straight to the point. They are super important. It can't be ignored even if there's no legislations in place.
Great. Thank you so much for this inspiring end of the session. Our 45 minutes are up, and I would briefly like to share a few final points. We will get back to you regarding any questions that may have been left unanswered. The link to the recording will also be shared with you after this webinar. And also make sure to check out our country risk register. And if you have general inquiries, don't hesitate to reach out to us for support. There is an email address in the chat that you can go to. And if you'd like to be informed about future sessions, please subscribe to our monthly briefings or also follow our LinkedIn account. Thank you so much for joining us today. We hope that this session has been insightful for you and are very much looking forward to getting in touch if you have any further questions. So yeah, wish you all a good day and thank you so much.
Thank you.